Okay, well, good evening, and thanks again for coming to Cardiology Grand Rounds. I think this one should be quite a bit of fun. I think we're very lucky at Duke to have several journals here at one institution. I don't think many places can really lay claim to three prestigious journals such as American Heart Journal, JACC Heart Failure, and the Journal of Clinical Investigation. But we're lucky to really have all three of those journals here and their editors. And so this is going to be hopefully a great and stimulating conversation about editors' insights on publishing research. What we'll do is we'll start off with each of the editors giving a little bit of their views and perspectives on research and the way forward for disseminating knowledge and making knowledge generalizable. And then in the second half, we'll try to open up for a question and answer so that we can have all your perspectives as well. And everybody who's attended here, all the editors have told me that they are willing to accept one paper from everybody. So it's good that you're here because that's your ticket to publishing. So first off, we'll have Dr. Daniel Mark, who's Professor of Medicine, Vice Chief for Academic Affairs, and Director of Outcomes Research at the DCRI. He's the editor of the American Heart Journal and will start us off. Thanks, Dr. Mark.
All right, so appreciate everybody coming, and I hope that we can get our intention is to really spend a bit of the part of the time discussing, but what we'd like to do is stimulate some discussion and interchange with you. So we're going to leave a fair bit of time to answer your questions, such as they are, and to discuss topics that you think are of interest. I thought we've got three different types of journals represented here. Howard, of course, represents basic science and a very broad spectrum of basic science in the JCI. I, at the American Heart Journal, represent a general cardiology journal, so the broad spectrum of cardiovascular medicine, clinical. And then Chris, of course, represents a subspecialty journal focused on clinical heart failure. So very broad to very focused, different types of objectives. There are some themes that you'll see that are common and perhaps some perspectives that may be special to the circumstances. What I want to do is to try to give you a little bit of an overview of some of the issues, having spent a fair bit of time in this business thinking about it and also thinking about why we do it. Periodically, when you're buried with 100 articles or so to try to make a decision on, you ask the question, why am I doing this? And so the answers are not always clear, but certainly it's interesting sometimes to step back and think about it. And when I say step back, I mean step all the way back to like the very beginning of the issue of why we do journals in the first place. And without getting into too much detail, we really can date the onset of journals back to 1665 in the Royal Society of London, but it really wasn't until the invention of the typewriter and carbon paper that it became feasible to actually make copies of a scientific paper so that more than one person at a time could have possession of the manuscript and could evaluate it. And it wasn't until 1959 and the invention and dissemination of the Xerox photocopier that it became feasible to actually send the papers out to other places to review for what we now consider to be a routine matter of peer review using national and even international review pools. And in the early phases of journals, really there was a lot more journal space available than there was papers. So there was a kind of reverse competition to what we're used to. In the 1950s and 1960s, as there was an explosion in science and in medicine and investment in medical research, that equation began to change. And in 1960s, the supply of research papers for the first time started to exceed the journal publishing space, so that there was actually scarcity. And peer review, which had been used for a variety of different reasons before then, was actually had the explicit purpose of trying to triage papers to decide which papers to put in your journal. That created a whole pool of rejected papers that then had to fulfill the demand for additional journals. So there was more journals formed for second-tier papers and third-tier papers and fourth-tier papers until you have the modern situation where we've got thousands and thousands of journals and all kinds of papers floating around. And the journal, what I like to call the journal food chain, was established, where there was the highest priority journal at the top, and then a fairly well understood sequence of prestige and priority below that, which was facilitated by this thing called the impact factor that we'll talk about in a moment. So if you were designing a process of creating a research communication, would you use the method that we now use now? This is a schematic that I found in a paper, came out a couple of years ago, showing the various loops and whirls that are involved in the production of a single research paper, starting with the authors, journal editors, reviewers, revisions, various revision loops between journals and editors and reviewers. All in all, a very pretty involved, arcane, not terribly efficient looking process. It looks a little bit like an electrical diagram, or maybe it's a biochemical pathway, I'm not sure. But so why do we do that? A lot of it is for historical reasons. That's the way we kind of evolved the process, and we've never really tried to re-engineer it in a wholesale fashion. The structure of the articles that we use now, which starts with introduction, then methods, research, and discussion, is at least 70 years old. Nobody's really just tried to mess with it over the last 70 years. Now, if it's a great structure, that's one thing, but if it's just the way we used to do it, so we continue to do it that way, that's not necessarily a compelling reason to continue. Brevity has become a very important thing in articles, particularly as this sort of perceived scarcity of space has become more prominent. Novelty is given priority, which it may or may not be such a good thing. And this peer review process that we're all used to, involving two external reviewers who are usually masked to the authors, has become the standard process. One of the biggest problems in this, if you look at it from the macro point of view, is that the editorial process at each journal is siloed, by which I mean you go through this extensive process, this back and forth that you saw in the diagram on the previous slide, and at the end of it, if you decide that your paper's not accepted, all of that just gets wiped out. All that effort, all that work is lost. And you start over again with a new journal for the most part. Now, there are some exceptions in the journal families, the Circulation family, the JAMA family, European Heart Journal families, JACC family, and what we try to do at the AHJ Appeals Court, and AJC has also tried to do this, to reduce some of that redundancy, but it's still a very inefficient, slow, ponderous, and painful process for the most part. So peer review is really the core aspect of all of this. And what do we know about peer review? What do we actually know about this whole process? It's ironic that the instruments that we use to deliver the evidence that we prize above all things in medicine has never actually been evaluated for how well it performs. So there's very little research on how we communicate research. Except, so we use tradition to communicate in ways that may not be so, that serve us so well. Richard Smith, who was the editor of the BRIEMJ for many years, described peer review, the core of this, as an expensive, slow, bias-prone, open to abuse, anti-innovation, and unable to detect fraud type of process. Not exactly a big advocate, but he didn't come up with a better system. Jerry Cassirer, who was for many years the New England Journal editor-in-chief, described peer review as crude and understudied, but indispensable. And the latest review I could find on the subject was done by the Cochrane Group in 2008, and they concluded that there was very little data to support the notion that peer review per se improves the quality of published articles. And you can think about your own work, and when you've submitted it, and when you've sent some of your best work in, how often does that peer review process really materially improve the work versus how often is it just rearranging the deck chairs to make some external reviewer who may or may not understand your work happy, and how much of that effort is actually useful. And then there's the Rumsfeld effect in peer review, which is where things get really aggravating. Rumsfeld, as you know, distinguished the known unknowns versus the unknown unknowns. And there's actually an interesting phenomenon called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is not being aware of one's own ignorance and pairing that with overconfidence. It's actually a thing in the literature. It's fairly well studied. And this is a phenomenon that can be seen in the peer review process. So reviewers are ignorant of the subject matter. They don't know that they're ignorant of the subject matter for one or a variety of reasons. And they act and represent themselves as if they're experts to the editors, misleading them and sort of sending the whole process off the rails. One of the reasons this tends to occur is that there's fragmentation of science, so that there are some areas, often increasing numbers of areas, where there are few real peers available to draw from in doing reviews. And then editors themselves, particularly if you're editing a journal that covers a lot of different areas, may not have the technical expertise in all the areas that are required to make judgments in. So you get a perfect storm. The editor's ignorant, the reviewer's ignorant, and nobody knows that they're ignorant. What's the end result of that? So what happens when papers get rejected at the end of all of this stuff? There's a number of journals that have looked at their own experience with this. I picked two as representative. And they both found that about 55 to 60% of the submissions that they rejected got published in other journals. And this involved anywhere between 70 and 115 different journals that ultimately picked up their rejects. The mean time from rejection to subsequent publication was about 15 months. Now, I think Chris may talk about this in the context of JACC, but what they found, interestingly, it's not necessarily directly related to this, but if you're rejected from another journal, it turns out you still have better priority, better citation experience than a de novo submission. Isn't that the case?
That's what's the perception of the rejected from JACC, other JACC.
From a higher priority journal.
The impact factor of those articles going into JACC intervention is higher than de novos coming.
Yeah. So there's some interesting stuff in there, obviously, and maybe we don't fully understand all of that. But so then a lot of discussion and a lot of anxiety in the journal business centers around this notion of the impact factor. It's a very simple calculation, really. It's the citations in a particular year from the articles in the previous 2 years over the total number of citable articles published in those 2 years. So it's a mean figure. There is no other statistics published around it. Everybody who deals with data knows that you don't just cite means. You get variances or standard deviations or interquartile ranges, but it is impossible to get any statistic about the impact factor except the mean value. It was proposed in the 1950s to evaluate the significance of a particular work from a historical point of view and its impact on the field. And then in 1969, when they started ranking journals, it was used to help libraries decide what journals to buy and how to spend their money. And over the last 50 years, it's gradually developed into the current monster that it is now, which is basically a self-reinforcing measure of journal quality, the papers in the journal, and the authors who publish those papers. Now, the problem is that it's a proprietary calculation by a private company where the data has never been audited and is not publicly available. You cannot get the data. One group actually published that they attempted to do the replication with their own journal and could not replicate the data, the figure with the data that they got from Thomson Scientific. As I said, they won't provide medians or any other information. It's clearly a skewed distribution. In 2005, Nature found 89% of its citations came from only 25% of its papers. It counts retracted articles. It's gameable and has a number of other difficult properties. One of the other problems is that the papers that tend to get cited in the biggest impact journals, the New England journals, JAMAs, and so forth, many of those are picked because they're dramatic in some way. And John Ioannidis, who's a epidemiologist out at Stanford now, has published a number of studies on this kind of thing where they were showing that those dramatically positive studies often in subsequent work tend to be shown to be either overly optimistic or downright incorrect. So that this cult of trying to get the dramatic breakthrough stuff in the high impact journals is actually maybe misleading and doesn't serve us all that well. Trying to get the negative study on the same subject into a journal, however, is a major slog and can take years and be extremely painful and unrewarding. So the final notion is just where are things going? And this is something that would be fun to spend a little bit of time thinking about. But the Web 2.0 obviously is a disruptive influence on this whole very well-established arena of journals and publishers and so forth. From the point of view of readers, there's the ability to access articles directly through the internet without having to go through the whole table of contents and even the journal's website. Journals and publishers are struggling to define a viable business model in this new era of open access. Peer review is trying to figure out what it wants to be now, whether it needs to change in some way, how to change, whether the web actually creates opportunities or different models that could be exploited that might do this job better. Authors, as a collective, hold the key to breaking the sort of cultic monopoly that journals have over our lives and careers, but it's not in the interest of any individual author to take that first step, so it's a difficult problem. And the public would like to see us triage our scientific results more effectively and efficiently than what we do right now. Just a word or two about the American Heart Journal in closing then. As many of you know, we get about 1,500 papers a year. Acceptance rate has dropped from 23% in 2008 to 12% in 2012. That's supposedly a marker of more exclusivity, but not necessarily the case. The meantime, the first decision's about 30 days. Our impact factor is 4.65, which makes us 21st out of 117 cardiovascular journals, but we're 10th in the number of overall citations for 2011. And the most interesting statistic that I've come across in a while is the number of uncited articles that we published between 2009 and 2010. I mentioned this at the American Heart Journal editorial board meeting last year. 9% of our articles for those 2 years have not been cited subsequently. Compare that, apparently, with 31% for circulation and 34% for JACC. So even though their impact factors are a lot higher, because you're dealing with a mean, you don't really know what in the world is, in a skewed distribution, you really know what's going on with the articles that they publish and how useful some of those are. And if anybody's interested, we have an editorial from a few years ago on the details of what we publish and why. And with that, I will turn it over to the esteemed Dr. Rockman.
Well, okay, thank you very much. Under much duress from O'Connor, I'm here. He got a phone call from me at 2 o'clock saying I'm bailing, but I decided to share with you some perspective to the Journal of Clinical Investigation. So we took over for the JCI, the Journal of Clinical Investigation, last year, March the 1. And so the JCI, the way it works is it's a rotating editorial board that rotates every 5 years. It's a competitive process where several years prior to the turnover of the board, you apply to a committee and go through a selection process to be the editor. And the editor-in-chief selects the board. The board lives or exists at that institution. And so historically then, the editorial board then will move from institution to institution across the country every 5 years. And I'll tell you a little bit about our board. It's also valuable that our philosophy is a little bit different than what you've heard from Dan, and I think it'd be nice to have a discussion about some of the philosophical aspects of publishing in a journal and what it means to that journal to have your paper and why we publish these papers. Okay, so a little bit of the history. The American Society for Clinical Investigation was founded in 1909, and in 1924, that organization, ASCI, which is it is today, established the Journal of Clinical Investigation. And so we've been publishing the JCI since 1924. Some of you are elected members to the American Society of Clinical Investigation. It's an honorific society that is meant for physician scientists that then there's certain, obviously, criteria to be elected to the ASCI, and it's under this association that the JCI is published. The first editor-in-chief was a cardiologist, Alfred Cohn, and he was thought to be, in fact, brought the ECG machine over from Europe and did some of the early pioneering work with ECG monitoring in acute MI and the like. In 1927, the acceptance rate was 71%, and in the good old days, and in 1996, we were free access. So all the research in JCI to this day is free, and so anyone could log in to JCI and get any paper around the world. The front matter, the part of the journal where commentaries and reviews, we call that front matter, that is still under subscription. And if you're at an institution, most institutions have subscriptions. So our mission is to publish the best in biomedical science by generating new knowledge that advances our understanding of the biology of disease and leads to therapeutic advances. And if you pick up the JCI, you'll see most of the articles in the journal are basic science articles. A lot of in vivo work, but it's a lot of model organisms. And to understand mechanisms of disease, it's frequent that you need to do studies where you remove a gene or you somehow do loss of function experiments or gain of function experiments and try to prove that this molecule or this pathway is involved in the disease. And that's by nature why the JCI publishes a lot of mouse work. Although, I'd say maybe 20% or so are human studies, and we try to encourage as much human research as we can, given that we are the Journal of Clinical Investigation. We cover all the disciplines in medicine, and in fact, we get everything from oncology and cancer biology, immunology. Half our submissions are in that area, and then the rest are split up relatively evenly across every other discipline. And consequently, you need an editorial board that has expertise in all of this. So this is what our webpage would look like if you went to it. And it's not that critical that we go through all of this, but I want to mention that one of the new things that we started was Conversations with Giants, and if you go to the JCI website and click on, you'll have some fascinating interviews with Joe Goldstein, Mike Brown, Bob Lefkowitz interviewed them, Francis Collins, Braunwald, and in fact, Varmus was recently interviewed. And we continue to post these interviews that we have with some of these thought leaders around every month. And in fact, they're fascinating. It's really a delight to listen to the perspectives of people who've been in science and have made some major contributions. The one thing we didn't talk about is that print is really gone. And in fact, it's probably likely that within the next 6 months, we will not print a JCI journal any longer. It'll be all electronic. We are going to publish, though, this compact 5 or 6 page summary of the articles of the month, and we're calling that JCI Impact. So you may see that on the shelf, but very shortly there will be no hard copy of the journal. The editorial board then is made up of scientists with expertise across all the disciplines, and we meet every week. So it's a little bit different for our journal than a number of other journals in that all the editors live either here or at UNC, with a few exceptions. We have a couple of people at NUS and a couple of people elsewhere in the country. And we get together every week, and we discuss every manuscript that we're going to publish is discussed in our board meeting. And it's lively. And really what the sense you get from that is that really it's the editor that is handling that manuscript that is ultimately making the decision whether that paper will be published. And so the review process is a little bit different for us in the sense that we do review, peer review, and we look to see and get help from reviewers external reviewers that get the manuscript, of which we send to typically 3. But ultimately, adjudication on that manuscript is done by the editor and the editorial board. And therefore, the review, it's not a hockey game. It's not, well, 2-1 for the paper's getting in. It really is. In fact, we've had papers where all 3 reviewers said this should be rejected, and we've taken that manuscript. Because we saw things that we liked in the paper that we wanted to publish that the reviewers were negative on. But for us, those negative issues could have been addressed, and we published it. Likewise, we've had 3 accepts, and we rejected it. Needless to say, the author didn't like that one. But it comes to the point where, and it would be valuable to talk about this, and that is our philosophy at the journal is authors don't have a constitutional right to publish the paper in JCI. The journal publishes what we want published, and you're free to go anywhere else. And that's why journals like PLOS ONE are so valuable. And I think it would be a very valuable conversation to have. So the editorial process, we receive about 5,000 papers, about 4,400 new papers, of which the rest are revisions that come back to us. Every manuscript is assigned to an associate editor who looks at it, and 70% are rejected, and we send back within a couple of days and say, thank you very much, but we're not interested in this paper. The criteria that we use are based on importance in the field, novelty, rigor of the science. And overall, we published 360 papers last year and an overall accept rate of 7.6%. Our impact factor is 13. And really, what tells us, or what criteria do we use whether a paper is worth reviewing? Well, we've adopted the attitude that every paper that comes in to our journal is essentially rejected. And then we ask ourselves, why should this, has the author made a case for this paper to be considered for publication or accepted? It's a little different philosophy than saying, well, your paper would be published, but these are the reasons why we're rejecting it. We don't think that way. We have a little bit different philosophy. And the reason for that is that the bottom line is that we want to try and publish the science that we think will lead to the best advances in biomedicine. Okay, my last 2 slides here is we see a lot of fraud, unfortunately. And data integrity is, in fact, one of my biggest disappointments of being at the journal. And so this is an example. I think you could see it pretty well. This is the figure that was in the manuscript that was sent to us. But when you blow it up, you could actually see that there was a tool, like a Photoshop tool, that was taken and sort of, tried to sort of soften a few things. I'm sad to report we see this often. And this is the stuff we see. Now, of course, we see it in blots, and we've tried to address it in some fashion. There's also other things where you could see that these 2 gels actually have been spliced. In fact, let me show you here. This is another one where it looks like it's a continuous row, but actually this guy came from somewhere else and was spliced together to make it look like it was a continuous row. So this is just the tip of the iceberg, sadly, because this is the stuff we see. How about the 10 experiments that were performed, but only 5 or 6 are reported because 4 didn't really work the way we want them to work? We don't see that, right? So, I'm not exactly sure how science is going to deal with this. We say that science is self-correcting, and over time, the truth comes out because people can't reproduce the work and whatnot. But I'll tell you something. Every time you look at your data, one, look at the primary data. Don't accept anyone's columns that average data, number 1. And number 2, think long and hard before you either throw out animals or subjects or data without really saying that, am I being honest and truthful in the analysis? So with that, I'll stop. And Chris?
I'm glad that Howard came. That was that was really good, Howard. Thank you. And when Howard saw all of Dan's slides, which was about 40, he said, "There's no need for you and I to talk, Chris." So we're in a different position. This is volume 1, number 1 of Clinical Subspecialty Journal, and this is like I'm like a pilot going down the runway. We don't know if we're going to take off or not. We don't know if we're going to crash. I mean, Dan and Howard are just the co-pilots over the Atlantic Ocean of a 747, and they're just taking over the reins of a previous editor who's done a great job with the journal. This is much more risky, launching a journal, but it's been a lot of fun, and I have to thank a lot of the our managing editor, Dr. Fuzat, and senior deputy editor, Joe Rogers, and many other people on this slide. We have no impact factor. It's kind of nice. I don't have to dance around impact factors. We don't get one until 2015. My term will almost be over. So I don't live and die by an impact factor. And we're on target to have about 500 submissions, and our acceptance rate is about between 10 and 15%. And a lot of similar themes. I'll go through these quickly because I want to go through the discussion. But I think the challenges are, even though we sort of negate the impact factor and try not to talk about, everybody talks about the impact factor. It's sort of the measure. It's kind of like the rankings of the NCAA basketball teams at the end of the year. I mean, people talk about it, and I'll show you some data on this. Timeliness is a big issue now. I think we live in a world where people want to get their research out, and we should get it out. We shouldn't be tying it up like Dan showed, 15 months on a resubmission. I think Howard nicely pointed out data integrity issues. There's conflict of interest issues we deal with. Open access, I'll mention. Digital strategy, I think Howard's talked about that. Print's gone for many journals. It's not going to be gone for JACC. It turns out that print is extremely important for your business model. That's where the advertising, that's where a lot of dollars are. So people don't want to give up print, but it may not be possible. And globalization, you should see the difference. 70% of the submissions to JACC now are from outside the US. So how does this impact factor thing work? And what kind of scale is it on? It's what's the impact factor for New England Journal? 50, and JAMA's like 28 or something, 30. So the highest ranking cardiology journals are Circ and JACC, and they're both at 14. And it turns out that this paper contributes 3 absolute impact factors to Circ. So Circ actually would be 11 without this paper. And so this is, what's that?
That's why they do one every year.
They do one every year. They do updates, they do this and that, and so we're trying to develop our own facts at the American College of Cardiology. They'll be different, the heart failure facts. How does the journey go? It is a journey, as Dan showed that nice slide, that you check in, you go to the managing deputy editor who signs it. Well, I look at it. We'll reject 10 off the bat, not 70. We're not that luxurious that we can reject 70 right off the bat. I had the honor of being rejected by Howard within 24 hours. That was a great honor.
I feel bad. I held it another year.
It's a Kaplan Meier. I got the 48 hours. Most of we pushed down to associate. This is fun. Associate deputy editors. Interestingly, what you need to know as faculty is that if there's a Duke name on that paper, it goes to a guest editor, and I really don't play a role in it anymore because there's an Uber guest editor. It was John Tierlink, and so it goes to a guest editor, goes out to reviews, goes back to the guest editor, and then we had Dr. Tierlink oversee all the guest editors, so there's a denominator and anchoring of what's going in the journal net. So I know a lot of you have come to me when your papers you submitted have been rejected, but I can't really influence those decisions. That would be a conflict. And then, this process we try to make 30 days. But actuality, getting into print is about 120 days. So what have we faced already? This is interesting. We've already faced some of these challenges already, ghostwriting. We had a full professor from an institution write a 200 referenced paper, single author. I said, I don't know any full professors who have time to write a comprehensive review on a particular drug. So I looked around in the literature. I found similar articles like that in European literature and stuff, and I said, whoa, we got to remove this. False data. When you see ejection fractions go up 10 points or peak VO2 go up 10 points, is that believable? I mean, this is what Howard's saying. Is it believable? So we asked for the actual data set, the actual data, and whether they'll give it to us or not, I don't know. But we said, I want to see that. That's amazing. I don't know anything that increases ejection fraction 10 points. And then what's happening across the world? In certain countries, you are paid $10,000 if you get published in a U.S. journal. And it's not just $10,000, it's $10,000 times the impact factor. So if Eric Peterson got his citizenship in a foreign country, he would be worth $5 million last year. I mean, it is amazing what's going on out there. Plus, this is a fascinating experience. So, open access, perceived importance, not a criteria for publication. What they do is look at the data analysis and the conduct and say, is the methods believable, is it rigorous? But they're not making a judgment like Howard is, saying, I think this is good science or bad science. They're just saying, was it done, we think, correctly? They publish daily. They're expected to have 30,000 papers in 2013. I don't know how you get an impact factor with that many papers, above 4. It costs $1,500 to submit. And, I said, well, I thought maybe just me and the bottom feeders publish here, but there were 10 Nobel laureates who published in PLOS. So it's a way to get information out there. And what Dan's saying is, should we, because we said the science didn't make sense to us, or the observation didn't make sense to us, does that mean it shouldn't get out there? So these get out there, and then everybody freely can attack the paper on the internet. This is what Jack is seeing with international submissions. The number one countries for international submissions are coming from India, China, Southeast Asia, but the acceptance rates for those countries are much lower. You're seeing it really and you see no more European, because the European Heart Journal has emerged as a significant challenge to U.S. journals. But you don't see the acceptance rates coming from those countries. So there's a lot of science quality that could be improved from these international investigations. So I'll just conclude by what we sort of look at for papers coming to JACC Heart Failure. We think that, being clear on defining your question and your methods, having adequate sample size, clinically relevant endpoints, good statistics, a plausible biologic explanation, and is there incremental value in what your findings are? So novelty, external validation, particularly biomarkers and genetic studies, is very desirable, but we hardly ever see that kind of validation. Clinically relevant, and is it citable? That comes into the question at some regards. And for authors, I would say the following, for what we believe, a clear message that's innovative, not me too, with strong methods, concise. We sort of look at 3,500 words as a tightening up the message. We think there's probably too much in the introduction and discussions. We've had people do dual submission. That's kind of, I always was a no-no. I didn't know that people did that. Came to us and came to another journal at the same time. Of course, I talked to these other journal editors, and we found out about that. You can recommend reviewers. Jack will take one of those recommendations. They won't take your laundry list, and they'll take them randomly. They may be a content expert in that area. Understanding the response you get, I think people don't realize sometimes you get a rejection, and it says, we'll accept a de novo paper. Well, that actually increased your probability of publication significantly if you get a rejection, but we'll look at a de novo resubmission. It actually puts it up to closer to 30% from the overall 10%. And I think one of the things that I would recommend for everybody in the audience is try to get into the review process. Be an excellent reviewer, because one thing, the journals hold metrics on this. So when they look at people to be on editorial boards and associate editors, one of the criteria is, have you done this process? But you also learn a lot about quality of papers, good papers, bad papers. So I think that's an important advice that I would give to potential authors. So.